None of this would be possible without the vision and the support that the European Parliament is providing us. And we really much appreciate the partnership we have built over the years. And because we believe, like you said, that for us to be able to defend and strengthen democracy, we need alliances between civil society organizations, but also between civil society and the European institutions. And your role and your leadership in that regard is very important indeed. Now, as I mentioned, at the core of the project was a series of opinion polls that were conducted in various European countries and were used by us and by our partners in developing some of the messages we had for the campaigns. And for that reason, we have invited Matthew McWilliams, who is the lead pollster and analyst we work with. Matt has been working in the United States and also Europe for decades now. He has extensive experience engaging in pro-European, pro-democracy and recently pro-European activities. And he has been the one who has developed and put in the field the opinion polls that we used. Matt, there is a lot to say about you, but I think the most important aspect to hear from you. So, I know it's quite early in the US at the moment. We wish we had you here with us, but thanks to technology, we can still have you. So please, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Petros. And I'm sorry I can't be with you all today. I love coming to Europe as often as I can. And I want to say just before I start the presentation, this is all about bolstering, building, and defending democracy. That's what it's really comes down to. So I'm going to show you a PowerPoint presentation. There's a lot of information in it. Don't worry about taking notes or anything like that. This is all available to you. And it is focused on reaching beyond our echo chambers. And that's the way that we're going to defend, build, and bolster democracy and the European Union. We have to reach beyond the people we normally talk to. And what I'm providing today or presenting today is a strategic analysis. It's not a question by question, poll by poll. It's really a strategic overview. And I want to focus in on the three things you're going to say three things. When you look at the presentation, you'll think it's a lot more than three, but the three things I'm going to focus in on. First is segmenting and targeting. To get beyond our base, we have to segment populations country by country, and then we have to target the people who aren't in our base. So how do we do that? And I'm going to use Portugal as an example. Portugal is one of the countries that we polled in. And then we're going to, once you get past, okay, these people are in our base, what do you say to them? Because they aren't in our base, so they are different attitudinally. They think a little different than we do. So how do we approach them? How do we connect with them? How do we share? We share a lot of values. How do we use those values to help them to understand that democracy is important, to fire them up to turn out for elections, to think in this time of disinformation, misinformation, to think and think about their values and what represents their values in elections and in their day-to-day lives. So we're going to do two things, the segmentation and targeting, which is who we talk to, and then what we say to them. What we say to them, the framing and the message, we'll use Estonia as an example, going from one end to the other, south to north. And in the interim, in between all that, we'll use examples of Germany to look at some of the data. Finally, any presentation on polling wouldn't be worth, and messaging wouldn't be worth anything unless we discuss the big elephant in the room, and that's the Russian war on the Ukraine. So in between the two segmenting discussion and the messaging discussion, we're going to look at recent polling on what Europeans think about the war. Because it really shapes the frame and message for Estonia that we talk about later. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Again, don't take notes. This is all available to you. But we did 2 waves of polling, 13 countries. Those in yellow, we polled just in 2021. Those in blue, 2021 and 2022. And those in white, 2022 only. So 3 waves of polling, 13 countries. The components from the 2021 survey were your typical demography, but then we added this second thing on top of it, which are worldviews. And we can use worldviews to segment. So how are people hostile, sexist or not? What's their ideology? Are they populist or not? This thing, EU segmentation, it's an approach, just 3 questions that was developed by the European Communications Department and EU Communications Department. And it's a really great way to segment people in EU countries. We also add then on some top line values. Are you proud of your country? Democracy, tolerance, orders. And then we get to the things you normally talk about in a poll, all these issues. But we use the worldviews and the values and the demography as a way to understand people's opinions on those issues. And then finally, we do something odd you don't normally see, reverse engineering questions. And what those are, quite simply, is just questions that allow us to take this data, take this targeting, and relate it to the online world. And I'll show you how to do that so that we can really apply, because everything we do here is about application. It's not, research is important, but it's only useful if you can apply it. And these reverse engineering questions allow us, along with the values and worldviews, to tie what we're learning to communications. And that's the key, tying to communications. Okay, so that was 2021 survey. The 2022 survey was done post-Russian invasion, was done in April. And it asked all these questions, but just think of these big buckets. It asked about the war, legitimacy of a Russian aggression. It asked about the EU's actions in response to the war. It asked about democracy, media, fear, including Russian disinformation, which I won't get into today because of time. And then also asked those segments and demography again. There's some commonalities between the 2 surveys. And those commonalities are everything that's in orange here. So democracy, very important because we find that it is a worldview that we can segment on. Media and social media uses. And then the segments that we'll learn more about in just a minute. And then obviously demography. So those commonalities help us link the polls together and link the learning together from the polls. So that's in the back end, or the, if you pull back the cover, that's what you'd see in the polls. Okay, so what did we learn? And again, it's 13 polls, 2 different waves. I'm doing an overview of this to show you how we can segment and target based on this, or how we have and applied it, and also how we can message and frame and have message and framed in Estonia. So I want to use an example about how we move from these worldview segments to targeting. So you can see that it's very, very useful. Mostly the presentations are done at the national level so that groups can apply them immediately to their work. Here, we're going to survey across many of these countries, but I want to show you the methodology and some of the data, which I think is pretty fascinating and useful too. So we're going to use climate change, big issue, obviously. The country is Germany, and the data comes from both 2021 and 2022. So public opinion in Germany on climate change. Right after the floods in 2021, it seems like a long time ago, but obviously it was very, very important moment. We found that 46% of Germans said protect the climate gradually, but without too much disruption to the German economy and society. That's that big yellow bar. The blue bar was climate change is urgent, we must act now. And the red bar is climate change is not a real problem, okay? After 2022, in 2022, after the post-Russian invasion, what happened to these numbers? Well, you can see that protect the climate gradually went up, climate change is urgent went down, and climate change is not a real problem, stayed around 10%, 9%, 10%. That 10%, 9% in the red bar are people we're never going to get. They are not people who are with us in any way, shape, or form, not just on climate change, but the segmentation says on everything. So we need to focus on the blue and the yellow. But you can see the climate change went down, the urgency of it went down. That's interesting. The post-Russian invasion, why would it go down? Because other issues were more important at that point, obviously, the post-Russia with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So a question that comes to us, the first question is, are there rails that run through the public opinion on climate change? We see that after two different big events, one floods, the other Russian invasion, the data is pretty stable. I mean, it varies within a range, but are there rails that run through it? And what do we think of as rails? Worldviews. Are there worldviews that run through that blue bar, the yellow bar, and the red bar and sort people into them? And the fact is there are. Now, a worldview is an outlook or set of values someone already holds. It's something that you bring to attitudes. So your attitudes are shaped by the worldviews. And so when you learn something or hear something new, how you hear it, how you interpret it, how you feel about it is shaped in large part by your worldview. And we go from worldviews, if we find that they work, to segments, to targeting. And by work, I mean that they're predictive of segments and people's opinions on issues. So we go from worldviews to segmenting and targeting. The targeting being the key part, because once we can target base and people who are not in our base, persuadables, and leave out the opposition for now, we'll get them later. Once we got our persuadables, we can target our communications. So let's go to Germany and apply this, because I'm sure it sounds, ethereal, and what is he talking about? Here's a direct application of it in terms of climate change that we just looked at. The worldviews we've tested on in Germany and across EU include all of these. Democracy to Europeanism, which would be the EU segments, hostile sexism, ethnocentrism. I won't read them all to you. In Germany, we found that we can go from worldviews, that's to segments, to targeting, using just democracy, feelings about democracy, authoritarianism, and Europeanism. The other ones are important at some level, but not important to go from worldviews to segments to targeting, which allows us to apply and communicate. So we really care about those. And we also found that most EU nations, democracy, which is consistency of support for democracy, authoritarianism, and Europeanism, the EU segments, are great ways to sort populations into our base, and in fact, activists within our base, persuadables, lean opposition, and opposition. And having those very simple ways that are replicable of doing it is a great, great find, because it allows us to fine-tune our communications to targets. So how do we do that? What is this worldview? So let's look at one practically, and you get to answer these questions in your own head right now, okay? So these are just yes or no questions, and they're very similar to consistency of support questions we ask on the polling to determine where people fit in consistency of support for democracy. So yes or no questions. Question number one, a democratic political system is a very good or fairly good way of governing my country. Yes or no? Get in your mind. Okay. Next, democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. Yes or no? Watch this one, because we've reversed the question, the way it's stated. Army rule is a bad or very bad way of governing my country. Yes or no? Keep tabs. How many yeses? And then finally, having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections parliamentary elections, not bothering, is a bad or very bad way of governing my country? Yes or no? Okay, tabulate that in your mind. If you said yes to all four of those questions, and these are questions that come from the World Value Surveys, Ipsos, Pew, used around the world, a little bit different on the poll, but very similar. If you said yes to all four questions, you're a consistent supporter of democracy. And my bet, if you're in this audience today, about 90 to 100% of you are consistent supporters of democracy. I just did this same test with a foundation. It was 89.97% of the people in the foundation were consistent supporters of democracy. Okay, the question is, what percent of Germans are consistent supporters of democracy, or Estonians, or French, you name it? But let's focus on what percent of Germans. And the answer is 38%. And I would bet that's a lot lower, first, than you thought, and second, than the people in the room who are listening to me today. So only 38% of Germans are consistent supporters of democracy, meaning they say yes to those four questions, and one other, we do 5 questions on the survey. So that gap is a challenge to democracy. 38% support is a danger zone for democracy, consistent support. Where most Germans fall out, in fact, most people fall out, is on the strong leader question. It's true in the United States, it's true everywhere. It's a challenge to democracy and a challenge to messaging, because when we're communicating with people outside of our base, because our base believes in democracy, I'll show you that in a second, and we're saying, yeah, yeehaw, let's go democracy. Democracy is great. A lot of these people have some questions about it. And so we have to message to them differently because they aren't as sold on democracy yet as we are, okay? So it's a challenge to democracy. It's a challenge to our messaging, because the messages that work with us don't work as well with people who are not consistent supporters of democracy. It's also an opportunity, because we can segment based on this. We know people who are consistent supporters of democracy, and I'll show you this in a sec, share many of our values and share many of our attitudes. And it's also an opportunity because we can ID the base, the people who are consistent supporters of democracy, those 38% in Germany, probably 95% of them are in our base. And probably 20% of them are the true activists in Germany. There's some young people who will not be consistent supporters of democracy in Germany who are also activists. And if we can ID the base, we can reach beyond the base and start talking to them. So if you want to link this to that climate change data that I showed you earlier on democracy, that 38% consistent support of democracy, most of them say climate is urgent, we must act now. But that's not the only worldview that works that way. There's also, oh, and here's consistent support of democracy across the 9 countries, just to give you a sense of the range. So there's Germany at 38%, Finland up at 48%, Romania lowest at 22%. Another way to segment, consistency of support for democracy is one way to segment. Another way to segment is attitude towards the EU. And this is done with 3 questions that were developed and are very, very useful. We test them as part of Listen to Europe and found them to be extremely powerful. I won't go through those questions because of time, but here's the EU segments in Germany. Red is bad, that's 24%. Bad in that they aren't on the side of the EU yet. So 14%, 30%, 32%. Let's put a little meat on that bone. The 24% are the skeptics, skeptical about the EU. 14% ambivalent about the EU. The 30% are kind of moderates. They're leaning towards the EU, but they're not totally sold. And in Germany, the 32% are enthusiasts when it comes to the EU. Okay, this is the EU segmentation in Germany. You can think of this as opposition, lean opposition, persuasion, and base. Base being the enthusiast. And within those base, they're activists too. Okay, if we put consistent support of democracy and these European segments together, we find that that 38% that supports climate and we must act now is very, very well represented. There's a high statistical correlation, not just in simple correlation tests, but also in high-level regression analysis with those two segments, consistent support for democracy and European support for the European Union and climate change. And we also find authoritarianism works really well in tandem with these two other variables, worldviews, to define who is most likely to be for climate change action now. And in fact, if I just know these three things about people, if they're a consistent supporter of democracy, where they fit in the European segments, where they fit in the authoritarianism segments, I can predict quite accurately where there will be on climate. Okay, that's all good, but it's not just a parlor trick, because these rails, worldviews, the ones we just talked about, consistent support for democracy, segments, and authoritarianism, are linked to other issues, behaviors, and demography. Yes, they are. And that's because worldviews cut across issues, in effect, linking them. And in fact, more polarized things are in a country, the more likely these worldviews are to cut across issues. What issues do consistent support for democracy, support for the EU, and authoritarianism cut across? Well, all of these. Not in every country, varies country by country, but they are likely to cut across most of these issues, which means all these issues are linked in people's minds in some way or another. That's very, very helpful and very, very useful for us in terms of targeting. So we can go from worldviews to segments. Those segments take us to issues, and those allow us to target for communications, which is the key about this. We want to target our communications. So Matt, how do you do that? All seems very, very theoretical at this point to you, I'm sure. Well, here's how we do it in Portugal. And one apology here. These are EU segments, the 4 EU segments. They're reversed here. Blue is good, again. Enthusiasts, 44% in Portugal. Moderates, 34% in Portugal. Ambivalents, 14%. Skeptics, 8%. So this is heavily, as you know, Portugal leans heavily towards favoring EU. And there are a lot of enthusiasts there. I think it was 32% in Germany. It's 44% in Portugal. So we can lay on top of these EU segments, using this as the base, all of the worldview and other data we have to target. And here's how we do it. First, think of a base, persuadable, lean opposition, opposition. First, we can put consistent support with democracy. And populism, too, on this comes up. So we can see that people who are consistent supporters of democracy are more likely to be enthusiasts and moderates. Those who aren't, more likely to be ambivalent and skeptics. We can also add a demographic to this. People who never attend church in Portugal are more likely to be ambivalent or skeptical about the EU. But that's not all. We can then add another layer to this, and this is using consistent support of democracy in a statistical model. We can add all these other variables to sort the EU segments. And it's not just sort them, they're already sorted, but to target, okay? So people who are not authoritarians, not hostile sexists, on the left, older, and higher ed are all more likely to be in the base or persuadable one in terms of EU segments. The opposites are more likely to be skeptics and ambivalents. And notice younger people are in the skeptics and ambivalence in Portugal. It doesn't stay that way. It will change around a little bit, but for this presentation today, we'll stick with it. We can also look at political choice. Chega supporters, you know, they're going to be persuadable on opposition. Regular church attendees, they're going to be EU enthusiasts and moderates. We can also add issues. This is where we link the issues. Satisfied with democracy, as you'd expect if they're consistent supporters of democracy. Pro-women's rights, pro-human rights, concerns about climate change. They are all in the EU base. And first level of moderates. We can also add specific questions about the EU. Here, those who thought in Portugal the COVID response was good are more likely to be enthusiasts and moderates. Those who thought it was poor, more likely to be skeptics and ambivalents, and the support for the recovery fund or not. And then also, we can finally add those wild and interesting reverse engineering questions. And these questions, it's fascinating that they map directly onto the EU segments. You know, legalized adoption with same-sex couples, wear a mask, abortion rights, these two political figures, Cristiano Ronaldo, that's a social welfare group. And all of these map right on to European Union segments, which means we can use all of these to target people online based on it. Very, very powerful. So we just don't have these segments. Now, people don't walk around with, I'm an EU enthusiast or I'm an EU skeptic. This allows us to go into a Facebook or an Instagram or online different platforms and define and target the base, but also the persuadables, and also drop out the opposition if we don't have the resources. And I would argue we don't have the resources right now to talk to them. So that is worldviews to segments to targeting and how we do it. That was part one of this presentation. Now we're going to have a quick break for EU attitudes towards the war, because it changes how we frame and message to a large extent, especially in Estonia, the example I'm going to get. Also, I think you might be interested in this. And then we'll go on to framing and messaging. So on February 24th, 2022, the world changed. We moved into a different world. And I think the assumption among many that EU attitudes towards the war, the conventional wisdom was there's going to be strong public opposition to Russia's war against Ukraine. And the question is that true? So we looked, you've seen this before, we looked at the war, the EU democracy, and these other categories. I'm going to talk about just the few boxes in orange. Legitimacy of Russian aggression is where I'm going to start. Support for sanctions, support for TPS and refugees, and the war effects on support for satisfaction. So let's look at Germany again, start with that just as the rail that runs through it, German public opinion. And my question to you is, and the question we asked, was Russia's assault on Ukraine legitimate or illegitimate? We asked this on a scale. So it's not a binary, it's not yes or no, it's a 0 to 100 scale. And then we take what's known as the mean of it. So what percentage of people do you think in Germany said that Russia's assault on Ukraine was legitimate? And the answer to that is 34%. I found that to be surprising. And I think a lot of people found that to be surprising. What about the rest of the EU? Here's the public opinion. This is again from April 22, 2022. Here it is, legitimacy of Russian invasion. Hungary, 47%, Greece, 44%. Let's group them, it's a little bit easier. Hungary, Greece, up there high, 47%, 44%. More than 4 in 10 citizens in those countries said there was legitimacy to the Russian invasion. Germany, Italy, Romania, France are grouped around a third of citizens saying that. Poland, a little bit outside of that. About 1 in 5 Poles think there was legitimacy. And Estonia and Finland, 14 to 17%, very small agreement. Most people in Estonia and Finland think that the Russian invasion was illegitimate and dangerous. But as you can see, EU opinions on this are not monolithic. They really vary, and some of them are quite surprising. Just so you know, the number in the United States at this same point was 33% legitimate. I see this as an outgrowth of disinformation. And these people, at least not in Hungary, but in Greece down to Finland, are the same people who are anti-vax. They were anti-immigration. They just fall into these categories, these polarized world vision very, very quickly now. They've been trained to, and it's an outcome of disinformation. So what about support for sanctions? Another obviously key question across the EU9. Here's support, strong support for sanctions. You can see Poland, Finland, Estonia. Blue is good. They're up there high. Germany and Romania in the 50s, 50 plus, almost to 60. Italy and France below 50%, 42 and 39%. And in the red, which means real danger, Greece and Hungary. There's just no support for sanctions in Greece or Hungary. Very little support at all. What about support for reducing or removing sanctions when economic costs are considered? So sanctions are costing us money, projecting in the future. Do you still support them? You can see here's we are again, people who support removing or reducing sanctions. Again, red is bad. Up top, Hungary and Greece, always up top. And then in the middle, Italy, Romania, and France, about 50% say, yeah, remove or reduce sanctions. Germany, 38, 35%. And again, Estonia, Finland in the blue saying, no, don't produce. It's still high. It's a quarter of the populations there. But they're, 3/4 are against removing or reducing sanctions, even if they cost the economy. All right, let's look at two last things here, and then we go to democracy. Support for temporary protective status of refugees. And you can see the support for temporary protective status for refugees really high across the EU. Finland, Estonia in blue again, very, very high. But look, from Poland to Germany, it's more than 55%, up to 60% for Poland, supported TPS for refugees. Only France was hovering around 51%. But it's kind of easy to say, yeah, I support temporary protective status for refugees because there's no, I'm not asked about any cost of that to me. So we also added, refugees should receive the same social benefits as citizens. Should they or not? And when you look at that compared to support for TPS, you see a much different story. Let me explain this to you. The blue bars here are support for TPS, which we just saw. The orange bars are support for refugees receiving the same social benefits as people in Finland, Estonia, Poland. And you can see the big drop in 5 countries: Poland, Romania, Hungary, Germany, and France. And in fact, support for social benefits for refugees is below 50% in those 5 countries. So when we start focusing on what benefits refugees are getting, support drops dramatically. You're looking here 10 to 19% drops. And what you really see is that Hungary, Germany, and France are danger zones when it comes to discussions of social benefits for refugees. Finally, I just wanted, this is just background on the war. This is our digression in the middle here. Effect of the war on satisfaction with democracy. And you would think, oh, EU's fighting this war, everyone's saying, yay, democracy, and it bolstered democracy. That's not the case. Let's look at Germany, satisfaction with democracy. And the question is, since the war started, my satisfaction with democracy in Germany has 38% say decreased, 19% say increased. That's a 19 percentage point loss or negative. That's disturbing. And the question is why? That we need to find out from focus group. I love hypothesis why, but that is something we really need to scratch down in the focus groups to figure out. But the fact is that satisfaction with democracy has dropped in Germany because of the war. And probably people think that we're not doing enough or we're not doing it the right way. How's that across all the EU? And here's where it is. Only 2 countries has it increased. This is a marginal difference. satisfaction with democracy increased in Estonia by 11% and in Finland 3%. 3% is statistical noise. It could be -3, it could be +3. But the decreased numbers are real. And it's a little hard to read the countries there, but Romania is the lowest at 42% decrease in satisfaction with democracy. Poland, 11%, Hungary, 16%. I won't read them all for you, but you can see satisfaction with democracy has decreased. So since the war, these questions, legitimacy of the Russian aggression, sanctions, refugees, democracy, we assumed monolithic support. It wasn't there. And in fact, what we see is a lot of polarization. Polarization that was similar to what we saw with vax, anti-vax, immigration, you name it. And that's getting picked up and infused into how people are viewing the war. And we have to be aware of that. So with that in mind, let's go to framing and messaging. And I'll go through this quickly because of time. And let's look specifically to Estonia. So we've focused on Portugal. We've looked at Germany. We've looked at all the EU 9 countries. But now let's focus on how do we frame and message in Estonia, given these segments, in a post-Russian invasion of Ukraine world. And here's how, first thing we have to understand, the Estonians, 54% of them worry constantly about the future. Either somewhat agree or strongly agree. That is a lot of people who are concerned about the future, and their messaging has to take that into account. But also Estonians' solidarity with the EU has grown. Now 65% of Estonians say we need to do everything we can to help countries in need in the EU. That's a good, strong number. It's up from where we saw it in 2019. And they're also in Estonia, Estonians are saying that, you know, the Russian attack in Ukraine demonstrates the need for a common EU defense policy, energy policy, food security policy, defense capability, migration policy. All of these things have made Estonians more likely to favor EU solidarity in several different policy areas, which is good. Here we have the EU segments in Estonia. You can see the base is just below 40. We've got persuasion, lean opponent, and opponents. Those are ambivalent and skeptics. These are the same questions that were asked in Portugal and in Germany to identify EU segments. They're predictive in Estonia of attitudes, the same way they're predictive in Portugal and Germany and France and Italy. And we can apply all sorts of data on top of them. I won't go through this to target, but I want to focus on framing. Okay, so how do we frame? What do we say to Estonians to get them more excited about democracy, more excited about the EU, even though they're pretty excited right now, more ready to take action on things, values that we share? And so what do we say to them? Well, the framing and messaging is real straightforward. First, the challenge is they worry constantly and the world's a dangerous place. So you have to acknowledge that in your messaging. You can't say everything's great, okay? It's not gonna work. They are worrying constantly. We saw that 54% worry constantly. Say they worry constantly about the future. But there's an opportunity here because we saw in the polling that people have rallied to Estonia and the EU's response. Remember, satisfaction with democracy we talked about, it had increased in Estonia by 11 points after the Russian invasion. So people in Estonia are rallying to the EU and rallying to the EU's response and rallying to Estonian nationalism. You know, not bad nationalism, but good nationalism. Pride in country, setting aside differences to be unified and get things done. So there's a real opportunity on the framing and messaging. These are different in every country. This is just Estonia. I want you to see how we can use this data to extrapolate, to come up with a frame and message that groups can apply. Extrapolate, that was the word. So the frame is simple. Values, strength, courage, unity, and enough of polarizing politics. Politics in Estonia were polarized on the right, left, populist, non-populist, anti-immigration, immigration, inequality dimensions. But right now in Estonia, because war and Russian aggression is tantamount in people's minds, right now it's enough of polarizing politics. We have pride in Estonia, and we need strength, courage, and unity to move forward. So that becomes, those two things, strength, courage, unity, and pride in Estonia, become critical framing values. Values of unity of purpose, unity instead of division, demanding better from Estonian leaders. I'm not fighting. Let's get something done to protect ourselves and to make the EU stronger. Estonians standing together, and the idea that division is dangerous and extremism is dangerous too. That is on the rise. So all of these are values that we can put in the messaging. They make a frame to communicate with them. And then finally, we have to remember respect for tradition and hope and anticipation for a better future. Because this is all about not just the crisis at this moment, but how can we make things better in the future for Estonia? We do it through unity of purpose, unity instead of division, pride, strength, courage, unity. So all of that is the frame. You can apply that frame, and I think people are applying it now because we had a long conversation with folks up there about a month and a half ago, applying this to messaging. And here's how the different sort of outputs of messaging, things that are goals, and it can be stated within the messaging as things that we're trying to attain. So independent, secure Estonia, democratic Estonia, strong, forward-looking Estonia, an Estonia that's part of a strong and forward-looking European Union. Now, support for European Union has gone through the roof in Estonia. And an Estonia where leaders in government put people before politics and listen to experts, very important in Estonia. So enough of this division. Let's listen to the experts and do what they say. And they want civil and human rights protected. And in the future, because when the war is over, hopefully sooner than later, economic inequality will come back in the mix. So people now on our side need to start talking about economic inequality and how we fix it. It's not a lead message, but it certainly has to be in it. So we can take those messages, put them in this frame, and communicate to the target audiences we can identify in Estonia. So that's a broad brushstroke overview of how we take segmentation and targeting, and then framing and message, country by country, and apply it to communications. Every country is different. There are some things that are similar. And what we found is these worldviews are great ways to segment across the EU. There are a few places where populism shows up, but usually authoritarianism trumps it. But if we're looking just at consistency of democracy, outlook on EU, my EU enthusiast and EU skeptic, ambivalent and moderate, which we can identify with just 3 questions, really smart questions that EU Communications Department came up with, EP Communications Department came up with, and authoritarianism, we can segment and then go to target people with messages that are attenuated for each country. So thank you very much. I know that's a lot of data, but I hope it was useful for you. And thank you. I'm happy to take questions at any time.